So in several of the previous talks, we've discussed the fact that maybe the whole notion of creativity is more cogent and more important today than it's ever been. And so in this talk, we're going to roll back and really look at a kind of historical perspective. And how did we get to this point? And how is our current era different from our parents' era, our grandparents' era, or history in a larger sense? So that's kind of the topic for today. So before we get into this discussion of historical perspective, I want to talk for a minute about Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class. You should be reading that. You should have read it by now, actually. And you're just reading one chapter in that book. And Richard Florida is an economist. He's an economist primarily of tech industry. So he really looks at the economics of the tech industry. And he's a real expert in that field. And he's written a lot. A lot of the content of what we're going to be talking about today is from another writing by Richard Florida, not the one you're reading. He's an interesting person for having this bigger perspective about the economy, about how did we get where we are and what are the characteristics of our current economy. Now, I want you to always, in all of our readings, but in particular in this one with Richard Florida, you should be thinking critically about this. I don't expect you to agree with everything these people are writing. I don't agree with everything they've written, but I want you to think about it. I think they're provocative essays that we'll be reading through the whole semester. And it's very important in the class that you actually do the reading. And from past semesters, students generally have told me, although I might not be a good reader in general, I liked reading these. They're short, and they're really, really interesting essays. So I want to talk a minute here about the way that I don't necessarily agree with Richard Florida. So I think there's some wonderful things about the chapter you're reading, but there is a perspective here about creativity and about creative problem solving that I disagree with Florida on. He tends to categorize certain disciplines or certain fields or certain professions as creative and other areas as not creative. So he wants to kind of categorize people as they're in the creative class or they're not in the creative class. I don't really agree with that. I mean, my field, architecture, is one he puts in the creative class. Yes, I totally believe that architecture is a creative field. But are all architects creative? Do all architects need to be creative? Actually, not really. Some architects need to be extremely creative. Some architects, it's kind of fine for them to do more yeoman work. So it's not uniform within that field. And I think that's true in many of the fields he talks about. I think that's probably true in software engineering. That's true in video game design. It would be true almost anywhere. The thing I want us to focus on for just a minute here is what's the difference between being creative in your discipline and maybe not being so creative in your discipline. So let's take the field of medicine, for example. I think it's perfectly fine to be a yeoman doctor and have a practice where you look down people's throats and up people's asses and, you diagnose rather routine problems with rather routine symptoms, and you're doing a good thing. You're providing a service to society, and those kinds of yeoman doctors, that's great. But then there also is a kind of doctor, often they're diagnosticians, who they have these very complicated jobs where somebody comes in and we don't know exactly what's wrong with them. And honestly, more and more in medicine, this seems to be the case. Definitely with my loved ones who've been in the hospital over and over, they go in the hospital, they have all these tests run, they're scratching their head, we don't know exactly what it is, let's try this, let's try that. These are problems that are not easy to solve. And a doctor needs to be kind of creative to figure out what is it that this person has and how do we solve the problem. There was a TV show a while back, and you can still see it all the time on cable TV, called House. And House was this very creative doctor, this diagnostician, and that where everybody else would be stumped, he could put 1 and 1 together and get 3 and figure out something nobody else could figure out. This is a creative doctor. And we need lots of creative doctors. We need people who can take complicated data that may be contradictory, that may not lead to one singular conclusion, and figure out a way to deal with it and figure out how I can treat this patient. That's creativity in medicine. Is all of medicine creative? Probably doesn't need to be, shouldn't be. But should some people be extremely creative as doctors? Absolutely. Let's take the same discussion in the law. I come from a whole family of lawyers. My brother's a lawyer, my son's a lawyer. There are lawyers all around me. And I realize that there are many lawyer jobs that are pretty algorithmic. They don't really require a lot of creativity. If you're doing financial planning for a big corporation, you need to know the law, you need to know what regulations are out there and what governmental constraints there are, and you need to know how money can be moved and can't be moved, and you're advising your client on how to make these transactions in a way that will be legal and will be to your advantage insofar as possible within the law. This is simply knowledge. This is simply application of knowledge for the most part. And then there are other lawyers that, whoa, these are very ambiguous situations they're a part of, and they require a great deal more creativity. A good example of that would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died not so long ago, was of course a Supreme Court justice. But as a young attorney, she was incredibly creative. Her interest was to get gender equality. And it's hard to believe that even in the 1970s, we did not have gender equality in the law. In the civil rights movement, we had begun to get racial equality in the law so that you couldn't treat somebody worse because of their race. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, well, if you've got equal rights, despite whatever ethnicity you are, why shouldn't you also have equal rights despite whatever gender you are? So in particular, she was interested in equal pay for equal work. And she's trying to get, a little bit better treatment of women in the workplace. So how do I go about that? How do I find the right case that begins to put in case law in the United States the idea that I have to be paid equal pay if I'm a woman or if I'm a man? That did not exist before the 1970s. So it's interesting that the first case she brought, she was representing a guy, not a woman. And it was a situation where this guy's wife died. She had a really good job. Their income from her job was important for their family's financial security. And that company had a policy that said that if, a guy died, that there would be insurance for his wife if she was a stay-at-home mom, then that would keep some financial stability for that family. But that policy only applied to wives. It said wives. And so this guy whose wife died, and he's in the position now of dealing with half the income they had before, and he wants that benefit. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg represents him and says, why shouldn't this guy have the right to that insurance policy just like he would have had if he were a woman? And that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. They win that case, and the gender equality idea is established. Then she could go back and she could represent that woman who's getting 50% the pay of a guy doing the same job she is, and saying the precedent's already been set for gender equality in the law. Therefore, this woman is suffering from discrimination because of her gender, and she needs to be compensated for that. So this is a creative lawyer. This is Ruth Bader Ginsburg figuring out, how can I make the law do the right thing here? And again, it is a field that everybody doesn't have to be creative, but we need a lot of creative people in the law. So as you're reading Florida, be critical. Think about what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And it's perfectly fine to say, I don't swallow it all. So now let's morph into this other argument that Richard Florida is making about historical perspective and what's different in the economy of today than in the economy of other periods of time. And we're going to be discussing this historical perspective in the context of Garrison Hall here, which is where the history department is here at UT. So let's think about how we got where we are and what role history plays in the kind of economy we have today. So Richard Florida is interested in how we got to a creative age. And that's what he calls it, this period of time where creativity is so important in our economy. And he takes a historical perspective on how we got there. And we're sitting here by the history building here at UT, and I love the idea of learning lessons from history. So what can we learn from history about where we are right now? So Florida says we began millennia ago in what he calls the agricultural age. And the agricultural age would have been thousands and thousands of years. It would have been primarily subsistence farmers. It really is a transition from hunter-gatherers to subsistence farmers. It incorporates both of those. So it would have been people at first, just searching around ad hoc, trying to find those blueberries or some kind of edible fruits or vegetables, or kill some quail or whatever. And then slowly making that a little more reliable, because hunter-gatherer economy is pretty hit and miss. So you begin to get a more farming economy, where you would plant your corn and plant your beans, and then you can control when they mature, and when you've got that food supply available, you raise those chickens and get their eggs from them, and then slaughter them maybe for meat. And it is the real creation of a subsistence farm. And for millennia, 99% of the people in the world were subsistence farmers. And there would have been a few people who would be monarchs or landowners, or the kind of people who had a lot of money, but the vast majority of the people were doing this subsistence farming, and they were raising their own food and their own, they were maybe a little cotton so they could spin it and make cloth out of it for their clothes. Maybe a little flax, maybe a little, maybe raise some sheep, have some wool that they could use, cut a little timber out of the forest there and build things out. So it's really having the entire economy built on their farm, this subsistence farm. And for generations, that's what life was, and that's what the economy was. In that context, there were a very, very few creative people. The dominant thing there was what we would call vernacular, which is that you do it the same way your father did, or your grandfather did, or your mother did, or your grandmother did. And you rely on tradition, and things are done the same way over and over and over again. But there would be a tiny little sliver of people there that might be more creative and might be interested in doing things a little different way. And in that sense, what was creative was cooperation. So saying, my land is a little better for raising corn, so why don't I produce the corn? Your land is a little better for raising cattle. Why don't you produce the cattle? And I tell you what, I'll get my milk from you, and you can get your corn from me. And there begins to be cooperation and a certain amount of efficiency that comes from that. So there is creativity in that context, but it's a tiny, small amount of the economy. Then we move into a mercantile age. And in a mercantile age, it really takes that notion of cooperation a step further and begins to establish trade. So that means that maybe I raise all cotton, and then I can do that very efficiently. My land is perfect for it. I'm a real expert at raising cotton. and then I sell it to a merchant who then takes it and then sells it to somebody else and distributes it all over the countryside. And in exchange for that, I get money. And then I can go to a market and get my fruits and vegetables and other things I need that I'm not raising on my own farm myself. And that begins to move into a mercantile age, where there are merchants, and the merchants are having to distribute and move around all of these goods. Still, the vast majority of the people are farmers, and they're involved in agriculture. But a small number of people have innovated and become merchants. And in that mercantile society, they begin to then need some innovation. They need transportation systems to get these goods between different people. And they need to establish market days and communities where people can come together and exchange those goods. So there's a need for a little more innovation than maybe there was in that vernacular tradition bound way of farming. So that's the mercantile age. And that goes on for hundreds and hundreds of years as well. And then slowly we morph into what might be called an industrial age. And that was where you begin to make factories and you begin to get manufacture and production. So now instead of all those individual people processing the cotton and spinning it into thread and then making it on looms into cloth and then sewing that, instead you begin to make a factory that makes clothes, and that you employ people in a kind of assembly line way that are doing each their specialized job, and collectively they're very efficiently making these clothes. And then that works with the mercantile economy to distribute it everywhere else. So the whole word factory comes from the notion of factoring, like 3 and 6 are factors of 18. You break down a process into factors, and you then assign different people to do different parts of it, and it makes it much more efficient, and in the end you can get a great deal more productivity out of that. So for centuries we were in an industrial age, and then at a certain point we morphed into what Florida calls an organizational age. And in that period you're actually taking these factory organizations and making even bigger organizations like corporations, and you're making large governmental organizations, you're making like large universities, and we're getting these great entities that are now requiring a great deal more creativity than existed previously. And we have new roles, and we have new gadgets we need. We get telephones, and we get washing machines, and we get all kinds of consumer goods that come out of the organizational age. And it allows us to increase our standard of living enormously. And there's just a huge bump in people's comfort and ability to live a kind of life that they want to live. So the organizational age really blossoms. But also people are kind of kept in their cog or in their role. People have very specialized roles they're supposed to play. They become a part of a larger organizational entity. And there begins to be a little bit of criticism maybe for the fact that it kind of does stereotype people and put them into a box. But the organizational age, very productive, and up until very recently, that's really what has made affluence much more common and brought a lot of people out of poverty all over the world. So the fifth period in this historical perspective is the creative age. And that's what Florida says we're in right now. And that it's fundamentally different than these previous eras, and certainly in terms of its economy. That now we don't need millions and millions of people doing agricultural work, because only 4% of our population today is in agriculture, and they're able to supply the amount of food that we need. And in fact, America exports a ton of food. So we can make agriculture incredibly productive with a very small number of people. And that means that we're able to, our capacity is so much greater through mercantile life, through industrial life, through organizational life, that now we can do things we were never able to do before. We can be incredibly productive in fields like music, or like film, or like art. We can be incredibly productive in fields like video games. We can produce many new products. We can improve things much more than we've ever been able to do before. And in that creative age, there's more demand for that, and the economy is more based around that. So he says that changes the economy, and of course, in changing the economy, then it has ramifications on power, politics, social, cultural kinds of manifestations. So the real point of this historical perspective is to see that, you know, today we have a different economy than we've had before. And it means that we have different jobs than we've had before. And it means that we have different skills than we've had before. And how can we, in a creative age, really optimize our own individual contribution to that? So again, as I keep saying in these talks, I want you to be thinking about this. Think about whether you agree with this perspective or not. Think about your own perceptions of that. And we'll talk about it when we have our check-in. Okay, see ya.